Are all the great love stories of history built on truth, or are some merely tragedies, polished and sanitized by power and time? We so often view the past through the lens of the victors, of those who write the official accounts. But what if the story were told by the ghosts, by the silences left between the pages? At the very heart of American history lies one such love story, one that shaped a president and a nation, yet was built upon a fractured foundation and a pain that was never properly named. This is the story of Andrew Jackson and the wife he loved to the point of obsession, Rachel Donaldson Robards. American history tells us of a whirlwind romance, a love that defied all social convention on the untamed American frontier of the late 18th century. Andrew Jackson, then a young, ambitious, and fiery lawyer, came to board at the home of the Donaldson family in Nashville, Tennessee. It was there he met Rachel, a woman described as vibrant, intelligent, and graceful, but tragically trapped in a loveless and abusive marriage to Louis Robards, a man of pathological jealousy and control. The pull between Andrew and Rachel was said to be immediate and undeniable, a kinship of two lonely souls finding one another in the harshness of the world. The official accounts, especially those sanctioned by Jackson's own political party later on, paint this meeting as a fated rescue. Rachel, a woman suffering her husband's cruelty, found in Andrew a protector, a knight who would shield her, and Andrew, an orphan who had fended for himself from a young age, found in Rachel a warmth, a home, a reason to fight. The story continues with Louis Robards filing a petition for divorce, and during the waiting period, Andrew and Rachel, believing the old marriage was legally over, were married in 1791. Here is where the tragedy begins. 2 years later, they were horrified to discover that the divorce from Robards had only been finalized after their own wedding. In other words, in the eyes of the law and society, for a period of time, Rachel was a married woman living with another man. In the starkest terms, she was an adulteress, and Andrew Jackson had married another man's wife. This stain, the label of adultery and bigamy, became a ghost that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was not merely a private matter. It quickly became the sharpest political weapon Jackson's enemies could wield against him. As Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, a politician of growing power, began his ascent toward the presidency, Rachel's past was excavated with brutal cruelty. The presidential election of 1828, one of the most vicious in American history, saw the opposition party launch a merciless smear campaign. They called Rachel an American Jezebel, a convicted adulteress, a woman of unfit moral character to be the First Lady. Pamphlets filled with the most venomous language were spread across the country, painting a picture of a depraved Rachel and a predatory Andrew Jackson who had stolen her away. Jackson was forced to watch as the woman he cherished was publicly defamed, shunned by high society, and made the subject of national gossip. He flew into rages, challenging men to duels for insulting his wife's honor, and his contempt for the political establishment in Washington grew into a profound hatred. Ultimately, Andrew Jackson won the election in a landslide. He had reached the pinnacle of power, but it came at an unbearable cost. Just weeks after his victory, before she could join him in the White House, Rachel died suddenly of a massive heart attack. At her funeral, a broken and furious Jackson declared, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers. I never can." For Jackson and his supporters, the cause of Rachel's death was clear. She had died of a broken heart, killed by the poisonous slander of his political enemies. This story became a core part of the Andrew Jackson legend, the devoted husband,
the man who would do anything to protect the one he loved, and the president whose deep resentment of the corrupt political class was forged in the fire of his wife's stolen life. This is the version enshrined in American history, a tragic epic of love, honor, and revenge. It is simple, powerful, and deeply emotional. But is it the whole truth? Was her death truly caused only by vicious rumors? Or were there other pressures, other unspoken griefs, silently eroding her soul long before the political pamphlets ever appeared?
But this heroic narrative, as clean and powerful as it is, begins to fray at the edges when we look beyond the histories written by Jackson's allies and his nation's admirers. When we listen to different voices from that same era, the story becomes murkier, and the characters of Andrew and Rachel far more human and conflicted. European observers of the time, for instance, particularly diplomats and travelers from the established aristocracies of Britain and France, saw the situation not through the lens of romantic frontier destiny, but through the rigid codes of their own societies. In their letters and diaries, they weren't crafting a national myth. They were recording social gossip. To them, Rachel was not a rescued damsel. She was, to put it bluntly, a woman of questionable standing. They noted her provincial manners, her pipe smoking, a common habit on the frontier but seen as coarse in polite European circles, and the inescapable fact of her first, unresolved marriage. They saw Jackson not as a chivalrous knight, but as a hot-tempered, violent frontiersman who had taken up with another man's wife in a manner that, in their world, would have meant social and political ruin. Their accounts lack the romantic gloss of American biographers. They are clinical, sometimes snobbish, and they strip away the mythology to reveal the raw social transgression at the heart of the story. To these outsiders, the Jackson-Rachel affair wasn't a great American love story. It was a rather sordid, backwoods scandal that was only survivable because it happened on the chaotic edge of the civilized world. Then there is the other history, the one not written in official records, but passed down in whispers and the oral traditions and folk memory of Tennessee itself. This is the history of the common people, of Rachel's neighbors, of those who knew the Donaldsons and the Robards before Andrew Jackson was ever a famous name. In this version, the lines between hero and villain are blurred. Louis Robards, while still painted as jealous and difficult, is sometimes remembered as a man of property and standing, who was publicly and profoundly humiliated. The folk narrative doesn't excuse his alleged cruelty, but it adds a layer of human complexity, suggesting a man driven mad by jealousy, whether real or imagined. And in this telling, Rachel is not simply a passive flower wilting under abuse. She is, to put it bluntly, a woman of questionable standing. She followed her heart, yes, but in doing so, she broke a sacred vow and defied the most fundamental rules of her community. This folk history doesn't condemn her as the political pamphlets did. Rather, it pities her, seeing her as a woman caught not just between two men, but between her own desires and the impossible expectations of her time. This perspective is crucial because it restores a sense of agency to Rachel, but it also burdens her with the weight of her own decisions. She is no longer just a victim of circumstance. She is an active participant in a drama that she helped create, and perhaps one whose consequences she never fully foresaw. It is here that the central, haunting question begins to form. If the official story of Jackson's heroic protection is the whole truth, why does a profound sense of melancholy seem to surround Rachel in almost every account, even before the presidential campaign? People who knew her described a woman who, as she grew older, became increasingly reclusive, pious, and sad. The vibrant girl Jackson fell in love with seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet, withdrawn matron who rarely ventured into the high society her husband was conquering. Was this sadness solely the result of the social ostracism she faced? Or was there something else? Was Jackson's love a sanctuary? Or had it become a fortress? And what is the difference, really, if you were the one living inside its walls? Jackson's defense of her honor was legendary. He fought duels. His rage was volcanic. His loyalty absolute. But this fierce protection came at a cost. In defending her, he also defined her. She became a symbol, an extension of his own honor. Her purity had to be absolute, her story simple and tragic to serve his own political narrative. Every moment she was in public, she was not just Rachel Jackson. She was the living justification for her husband's duels, his grudges, his entire political identity as an outsider fighting a corrupt elite. Can we imagine the immense psychological pressure of being placed on such a pedestal? To live your life as a symbol, your personal history reduced to a political talking point? Perhaps the silence we sense from Rachel in the historical record isn't contentment. Perhaps it is the sound of resignation. The tragedy may not have been the public slander of 1828, but a private sorrow that had been growing for decades, a sorrow born from a choice made in passion that led to a life lived in the shadow of her husband's towering and perhaps suffocating love. This brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all, that Andrew Jackson's love, the very force that history credits with sustaining Rachel, may have also been her gilded cage. He built a fortress of honor around her, defending its walls with the fire of a zealot. But a fortress by its very nature is also a prison. Inside, was Rachel truly safe, or was she simply isolated? Isolated not just from the public, but from her own path to peace. As the years passed, Rachel grew intensely religious. This is a well-documented fact. She found solace in the church, in prayer, in the promise of divine forgiveness. But forgiveness for what? The official narrative would say it was to find strength against the cruelty of the world. But could it be that in the quiet moments of prayer, Rachel was grappling with a far more personal and profound guilt? A guilt that her husband, in his righteous fury, could never acknowledge or understand. In the eyes of God, and in the unyielding moral code of her time, their life together had begun in sin. While Jackson, the man of action, saw the legal technicality as an insult to his honor, to be avenged with pistols and political power, Rachel, the woman of faith, may have seen it as a stain on her soul to be cleansed with repentance. And here lies the heart of their unresolved conflict, a one played out not in arguments, but in silence. Could it be that what Rachel truly needed was not a champion, but a confessor? Not a defender, but someone to share the spiritual weight of their past. Jackson's love was a declaration of war against anyone who questioned their union. But what if Rachel's soul craved peace? His constant battles, his public rage, his insistence on her absolute unblemished victimhood, all of it kept the original wound from ever truly healing. Every time he fought for her honor, he was reminding the world, and perhaps reminding her, of the very transgression she so desperately wanted to lay at the feet of her God and forget. Imagine the impossible dilemma. To find her own peace, she might have needed to acknowledge the complexity, the mistake, the shared responsibility of that fateful choice made so long ago. But to do so would be to betray her husband, to undermine the very foundation of his political persona and the justification for his life's battles. Her public identity was inextricably tied to his. Her sainthood was necessary for his crusade. So she remained silent, trapped between her husband's worldly war and her own spiritual one. The political attacks of 1828 were not, perhaps, the cause of her death. They were merely the final brutal act in a tragedy that had been unfolding for over 30 years. They were the public screaming of the very words she may have been whispering to herself in private prayer for decades. The slander didn't break her heart, it simply confirmed her deepest fears that the stain could never be washed away, not in this life. When Andrew Jackson stood over her grave and cursed her murderers, he was solidifying the story he needed to believe, a story of heroes and villains, a black and white. It was a simple, powerful narrative that gave him a righteous cause and shielded him from a more painful, complicated truth. But it was his story, not necessarily hers. We are left, then, with a profound and lingering question. Andrew Jackson won his war. He defeated his enemies, he reached the highest office in the land, and he enshrined his beloved Rachel as a martyr in the annals of American history. But did he ever truly understand the woman he was fighting for? Or was he so consumed with defending her honor that he failed to see the quiet agony of her soul? The official history gives us a love story, but the silences between the lines suggest a tragedy far deeper, the tragedy of a woman whose true story may have been lost, buried under the weight of a great man's love and a nation's myth. And her ghost remains, not as a symbol of political slander, but as an eternal question about the stories we tell ourselves and the truths we choose to leave in the dark.